Waterbeach is the thriving new community that offers the best of lakeside living just minutes from Cambridge. With new cycle routes that take you to the Science Park in 25 minutes, Waterbeach is the perfect place for you to call home. New 2 and 3 bedroom flats and 3 and 4 bed houses from Carla and Stonebond are available now, with show homes open every day. No need to book an appointment, just drop in and discover how you could start your story at Waterbeach. For more information, please visit waterbeachwb.co.uk or email hello@waterbeachwb.co.uk. Welcome to the Cambridge Tech Podcast, talking all things technology from the heart of the UK's tech capital. Here are your hosts, Faye Holland and James Parton.
Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Faye. So, another week, another dollar. James, what have you been up to?
Nothing really kind of exciting, but nothing really worth talking about on the podcast. Yeah, just a pretty standard week. We've actually been doing quite a lot of podcast stuff this week, haven't we? So that's taken up quite a bit of time and planning for next year, which is always exciting. I'm sure you've been way more busy and exciting and travel-y and eventy and all the things I can think of.
Gosh, now I feel under pressure. So I don't think I've been travelling at all. I think that's next week. I've done lots of project client stuff. That's kind of keeping me sane. I've got a big event on next week, which is not making me at all stressed out. But it'll be fine. I've run so many events over the years that I literally have 2 pieces of paper, one with a picture of the layout and one with a few notes on it. Everything will be fine, right?
Of course, yeah. Mark's got it all under control, hasn't he?
Yeah, because it's at the Bradfield Centre, and Mark is graciously hosting this rather small event. So I'm sure there'll be more news on that next week. Everyone thinks I'm mad, but there you go. So I've got another random piece of information for you. Are you ready?
Go on then.
So I have been on LinkedIn for 20 years this week. 20 years. So go on, how long have you been on LinkedIn? Because I know you wouldn't have let that piece of information go without being competitive.
Well, it did make me go and have a look, and it took me ages to figure out how to find it, but I'm 6 months older than you, apparently. So my join date was April the 27th, 2004.
But you didn't celebrate it, and you didn't bring it up on the podcast, so we're just going to ignore it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Talk about me. Actually, do tell people how they find it. Let's have a little bit of someone come and tell us how much longer you've been on LinkedIn than we have.
Yeah, it's not easy. It was, hang on, now I'm going to have to just go back to, so you go into your so you click on your profile picture, you go into data privacy, then you go into manage your data and activity, and then you scroll right to the last page. Tells you there when you joined.
Well, thank you for researching that. You see, I just got a notification that came up which told me that I'd been on there for 20 years. It came up with a really rubbish post though, so I had to redo that, obviously. And the funny thing is, and you would have got one of these too, now there's a slight order of magnitude issue here. I remember getting given like a little badge, and the badge was, and I can't remember, it was either for the first 100,000 users or the first 1 million users in the UK. And I know there's a slight order of magnitude difference there, but there is no way I'm going to go back and find it and brag about this badge, because it'll take me forever to go back through all that. So that's our updates. We do have a broader update for everyone before we move to the tech news, and it's some sad news. The Cambridge community, but actually international community, was engulfed with some sadness this week as we found out that Peter Cowley had passed away. He passed away peacefully on Saturday the 6th of November at his home, surrounded by his family.
Yeah, I mean, what a giant. Peter was such a key figure, as you say, Faye, both the Cambridge, the national and European startup scene. And he was just so generous with his support and his knowledge. and just, so open about the challenges he's faced in his personal life and how he documented his fight with cancer. Just, really inspirational, and he'll be missed by everyone.
Yeah, he certainly will. And I think you can see that if the outpouring of messages, tributes, on social media and messages to the family has been absolutely phenomenal. And I know for one, Peter would be loving it. I was just talking to him and Nicola about it. He'd be looking at the analytics and going, look at this, where can we get more? And, he would absolutely love it. There'd definitely be a spreadsheet involved in there somewhere. But yeah, as you said, he talked to us on the podcast really openly about the book launch, Public Success, Private Grief. And we also had one, and the title of it, I can't remember it exactly, but it was like renowned entrepreneur, serial investor, and all-round good bloke. So, as you say, great colleague and advisor and friend, and he'll be missed really deeply. So from the podcast, from us both, we send our love and prayers to his wife Liz, his son Matt, and to the rest of the family.
So just 2 pieces of tech news this week. Do you want to do the first one, Faye?
Of course. So last week we shared partnership news from Cambridge clean tech company Levidian. This week they've launched their 2nd generation loop technology, which is a major step forward for the graphene industry. The company says it will deliver unparalleled graphene production that is less carbon intensive, more affordable, and a higher quality than anything else on the market today. They're working towards an annual production target of 50,000 tonnes by 2030, which will make them one of the world's largest producers of graphene, if not the largest. So a quick refresh on graphene. It has almost endless use cases. It's already being deployed in a variety of products to boost performance and drive down carbon footprint. So some examples: batteries that charge 30% faster and last 27% longer. Concrete that has a 30% reduction in carbon emissions and is 35% stronger. And tyres that have a 23% reduction in rolling resistance. So, some real impact can be made with this company and what it's doing.
Absolutely. The second story features a Cambridge company called DNA Ascendancy. They have developed what it calls the world's first practical DNA computer. Such computers use DNA as the medium for computation instead of traditional silicon. DNA Ascendancy's origin traced back 8 years to Professor Ross King's research at Manchester University, and Professor King is now a Professor of Biotechnology at the University of Cambridge. Now, a DNA computer, through trading space for time, enables desktop machines to outperform the world's current fastest supercomputer, whilst consuming a tiny fraction of the energy. This is possible because in such a computer, each DNA strand is an independent processor. Use of DNA in this way enables far greater density of memory and processing capability than silicon, because DNA can be accessed in 3 dimensions. Now, I don't know what you're thinking here, Faye, but regular listeners know it's taken us probably 3 seasons of the podcast to start to get our head around quantum computing. This is DNA computing is already giving me a bit of a headache, so we should definitely invite them onto the podcast to explain more.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating, so let's get them booked on. So let's move on to this week's episode then. We have another startup story for you, and today we're talking to James Lee, who's co-founder and CEO of Wave Photonics.
James, thanks so much for taking the time to come onto the show today. You're a neighbour, so you haven't had to come far. Why don't we start with just getting to know you a little bit better and your personal background? Yeah, pre-university, where did the interest come from, tech and science? What was your inspirations there?
Yep, there's not a super simple, easy answer. It's just always been space physics. That's always been the area I found most fascinating, and then I just carried on doing the most interesting thing at every step and ended up here.
Yeah, and you've been to all of the blue chip universities. You've done masters at both Oxford and Cambridge. What was that experience like? What was the contrast between the two?
Yeah, lots of people ask the difference between Oxford and Cambridge. They're quite similar. I think my experience was different in both places, because in Oxford it was very much a normal undergrad. And in Cambridge, it was part of a centre for doctoral training, so like a run-up to a PhD. So there are quite different experiences. I don't think the universities are necessarily that different.
And at that point, was your kind of appetite whet for entrepreneurship, or were you focused purely on the studies?
No, so I was purely interested in physics and quantum technology, just out of interest. The entrepreneurship side, it never really entered my mind that it was something possible until one of my friends during the PhD dropped out to start his own company. And there was the realization of he is like a smart and motivated guy, but not impossibly smart and impossibly motivated. So it opened my mind up to the fact that that was a possibility. It was not something I'd ever considered that was an avenue that was open to me before that.
Okay. So this was around 2017 you were doing the PhD, is that right?
Yeah, 2013 to 2017.
Yeah. And then you became the Enterprise Fellow at QTech, which is the quantum accelerator at Quantum Technology Enterprise Centre. How did that opportunity come about?
Yeah, I mean, I had a brief detour through quant finance first. And during that time, I didn't find quant finance particularly rewarding. And I did have then evenings and weekends to explore an area that I thought was interesting in the PhD that I never got a chance to explore, which was like computational design for photonics. And so after some time playing around in my spare time, I thought, okay, if there's a time to take a big, stupid risk and start a startup, it's when I've got no real responsibilities. And QTech at Bristol was a good option to do that. It was focused on taking scientists who didn't really have any entrepreneurial or business experience and helping them get started. And it was a very good program. It lasted a little over a year, but it gave you a year to make all the stupid mistakes and figure things out, which I think a lot of accelerators or incubators don't.
And that was really the birth of Wave at that point, was it?
Yeah, I think that the idea was there before I went
Right.
to QTech, but that was where you first started looking at it seriously rather than some messy coding in my bedroom.
Fayod's going to jump in a second and get into the detail of what Wave is, but what's the higher level? What does Wave do in a few words?
Yeah, so we do design for integrated photonics using the same kind of process that you use to make conventional semiconductor chips, but you make chips that guide and manipulate light. So it means that you can take optical technologies and shrink them down into like chip size and mass produce them cheaply. So it's the same kind of benefits that you get for integrating electronics.
Yeah.
The big area of interest is for tackling the kind of energy and bandwidth problems in data centers. That's where the whole market is today. And there's then a big sort of second boom driven by the need for AI model training and the demand for bandwidth there. And then in the longer term, it's a way of taking not any, but many optical technologies and shrinking them down. So things like sensing and quantum technologies they're areas that I think are exciting for the long term. Yeah. So we do design for those chips.
So let's come on to that in a little bit more detail, first of all, but I can't let it go with where you said it was a big, stupid risk. So a couple of weeks ago, we had David Cleevely on the podcast and he said, whatever you do, don't do what I do. So there's some kind of thread coming out here. But tell me, what was that formation story like? You decided to take the risk. What were those steps that you took?
I quit my job in finance to work on this. Like wildly and stupidly early. Like I probably would get a little bit further on before doing that if I were starting again. So the initial idea was, okay, there's this really interesting approach to photonic design that's just better than the way that things are done as a standard today. But it wasn't the standard, and so the idea initially was, okay, let's see if we can change that. Then quite quickly found all the reasons that it wasn't the standard and tried to go about fixing those. And then I got my two co-founders involved, so it wasn't all three of us all at once. One of my co-founders, Matt, we worked together at Toshiba in Cambridge during our PhDs. So we got the very first basic version. We were working on the very first demo. And then after that, one of my former colleagues from when I was working in an investment bank, his background wasn't photonics at all. It was stats and high-performance computing. My pitch to my co-founder was, don't know what he'll do if we can get him to join us, but it will be good. And I thought it was very unlikely that he'd join us because he just had a fancy job offer from a hedge fund, and this was, do you feel like maybe having a quarter of the salary and coming and working on this with us? And he did. And then it turns out this wasn't planned. It was just lucky that you can use some of the maths that we're using to model equity derivatives, to model process variation for integrated photonics, which then helps solve one of the big design problems that we had.
Okay, so you find yourself with now 3 founders going through this journey. And at what stage did you end up on the second accelerator with Deep Tech Labs? And why did you decide to go that route again? Was it because of the experience you'd had in Bristol already?
Yeah, QTech branded itself as an accelerator. It was more an incubator. There was some training there, but the real thing it gave you was time. And then Deep Tech Labs was not the second accelerator we went through. We actually went through another one, Skydeck in the US. The Berkeley Skydeck Accelerator. So we decided to go through that because we wanted some exposure to the kind of big, crazy Silicon Valley startup side of things. And it was eye-opening.
In what way? Just tell us a little bit more about that.
It just makes Cambridge feel sleepy.
Okay.
The level of optimism and ambition is just orders of magnitude more than what we have here.
And it's real, it's tangible, it's deliverable as opposed to being hyped?
I'd say a mix of both,
Okay.
but clearly it is to some degree real, right? There's this belief of, oh yeah, of course you can make $1 billion company. Like I know 3 other people that did. Like building companies, building startups is a much more common to see startups grow and scale very quickly. At least if you're spending your time at an accelerator, I guess. We learned a lot, but probably the biggest thing was changing the mindset. Instead of, okay, how can we build a little steady company? Let's try and be a little bit more ambitious. So to go back to the original part of the question about Deep Tech Labs, that was a program we went through a bit later. They're focused a lot on, rather than your seed round, building up to your Series A. And it was a very good experience for us because they were very highly focused on deep tech and semiconductors, which meant the advice you got was very tailored to what we do and what we need. Skydeck, while it was great from some perspectives, you got a mix of advice, some that was more targeted at, say, B2B SaaS companies, and then you have to try and pick out what advice is relevant to us, whereas there were access to a ridiculous number of experts and people who've been there and done it before. Basically, my criticism to them was the program was too short because we'd have a session one week and realize, oh, okay, we're doing this area completely wrong and we need to change it, and you'd barely got started implementing that, and you'd have the next one and realize another area that you were completely messing up and had to change. So it was very good. Yeah, just an incredibly tightly focused accelerator.
Okay. And so you raised your first round of funding earlier on this year, was it?
Our very first round of funding was a small pre-seed round back in 2021. And that, plus some money from accelerators, plus some grants, got us to the stage where we could demonstrate the technology. And then on the back of finally proving that it works, then we raised the seed round earlier this year.
And from what you've just said, did you have to curtail what you needed at the time? If you were talking to some of the US investors as well, were they saying, no, go bigger, take more funding, or did you just decide to take what you actually needed at this stage?
We actually ended up with a little more than what we needed. So yeah, it would be nice to say we were there turning away all kinds of funding. We weren't. We managed to get the investment that we wanted, and then, as seems to happen a lot, as soon as it's there and secure, you get offers of a load more. So we took a little bit more, but not too much.
Very wise. So you mentioned earlier on that you've gone through some different iterations on the core technology. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what the technology is and why it's different to anything else that's out there?
Yeah, so the core of it is based around this approach called inverse design. That's not something that we invented. That was the original inspiration of seeing the early work on inverse design. And what that is saying, instead of trying to design a component or come up with a design that does what we want, you instead start with what performance do we want, and then through a bunch of different tricks and a load of computing power, come up with a design that meets these requirements. So that was the core of it. That was the starting point. And then we realized that by itself is not enough, because it assumes you have like perfect and ideal fabrication processes. But actually, when you make these things, they come out a little bit different every time. Sharp corners get rounded. What you design and what gets made isn't exactly the same. And so to make that work, that's where my third co-founder came in, with doing some modeling of the variation of the process and including that in the optimization. So that's the core of the technology. But getting that to work, I don't want to say it was super easy, but it wasn't the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge technically was getting it all to work reliably in parallel without a human in the loop. So we don't want to be able to design one component at a time well with engineers in the loop. We want to be able to design entire libraries of components without an engineer in the loop. So in the end, we want hundreds of thousands of different designs, and you can't do that manually. And so getting it to be robust and getting it to work without engineers in the loop was the biggest challenge. Even though that doesn't sound like the core differentiating technology, I think that's actually the toughest part of what we've done.
Yeah, that's where you start to get scale as well, isn't it? So let's talk about your customers for a moment then. So you've mentioned quantum, you mentioned data centers earlier on as a big opportunity. Who are you looking for as customers, and what are they going to get from you?
At the moment, we are looking for customers who can benefit from the current stage of our technology. So that's largely people who are still in R&D. So what we can do well today is come up with high performance, fabrication tolerant designs, but very quickly. And so that's useful for customers that are building their circuits for the first time. So often that's, say, quantum technology companies, because they need to use like a range of non-standard wavelengths on new material platforms. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there's the telecoms and datacoms companies. So we have these two kind of competing pulls. There's the pull for companies very early on in R&D with new materials and new wavelengths, because we have a very strong USP there. On the other end of the scale, there's telecoms and datacoms, where the offerings, they're not great, but they're already there. So we're like less differentiated there, but the market is much bigger. So we have competing pulls, and it's not yet obvious which one wins. But my view is, in the near term, we're focused on customers still doing their own R&D, because that's where we have the strongest differentiation.
Possibly an easier route to market, because otherwise you're looking at displacement of older systems, and that process may be a little slower and bureaucratic than, for example, someone who's just starting on their own journey too.
Yeah, we have to accept we're a startup. We are a risky proposition for anyone that wants to work with us too. And so we would be better working with people who have no choice but to take a risk.
So if we just switch gears then and talk about Cambridge, what's the experience of growing a deep tech company like Wave in Cambridge?
I haven't got a comparison to anywhere else. This is the first time I've done this. We did set up in Cambridge with the idea that we would be able to hire people out of the university and from the rest of the Cambridge ecosystem. In fact, we haven't really done that very much. We've been pulling people across from Bristol and Oxford and from Southampton, because at least today, there's not a huge amount of integrated photonics work happening within the university. There's some, but less than in, say, Bristol. So to start with, yes, we had the idea that we'd be getting lots of talent from the Cambridge ecosystem, but that's not how it played out. But then more recently, yes, we've been not out of the university, but from some of the other companies in Cambridge, we've been finding talent there.
You say that you're drawing as well from people from Bristol, Oxford, etc. Is it easy to relocate people? Are they happy to come to Cambridge? What kind of overhead does that put on top of the recruitment process?
Yeah, I mean, it mostly slows things down a little bit. We've only really hired people who could relocate, and Cambridge is a fairly nice place to be. So it's not been a huge problem, and they're already moving from very expensive cities. So
when you were describing your your kind of earlier experiences, it seems that the Berkeley experience really made an impression on you. Have you been tempted by thinking about the US as a place to open up or even relocate? What's your thoughts towards the US market?
We certainly have to have a US presence at some point. I mean, most of the markets there, we can't be a big company without that. In terms of actual relocation, I don't know. I think it's likely that most of the research will still happen in Cambridge regardless. But yeah, we don't have concrete plans yet. But it's something we definitely want to do. We just want to work out the right time and the right way to do it. And practically that's likely going to be through pull from a customer rather than spending a huge amount of money getting set up and on Bay Area salaries for no immediate benefit.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you touched on the wealth of support you got from mentors on the Deep Tech Labs program. Has that support in the ecosystem continued?
Yeah, it's surprising how often you just run into people who have been there and done it before with semiconductor companies in Cambridge. Through Deep Tech Labs and then also through Silicon Catalysts, the Chip Start program, it was not just based in Cambridge, but you would go to the various events and there'd be an awful lot of people from Cambridge there.
Yeah.
So
that's good to hear.
So the final question is, what's next for you? You've talked about this raise. You've talked about recruiting people and from different locations. What are your plans?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really a change in focus. So from the start, because we weren't a spin out, because we had to build up all the technology from scratch, the focus was 90+% on getting the technology to work. And now we have more resources. That means the focus is more on, okay, we need to prove that this is useful and take this to multiple different fabrication processes, including some high volume ones, to really validate the approach that we're taking. So the focus is switching from proving out the core technology to building it into a product and bringing in customers for that.
Can I just jump in on that data center point? Because we've been prepping for our now annual episode with Ben from Deloitte. And without giving too much away, one of the key predictions is around the escalating costs around the data centers for hyperscalers and how they need to address that and make them more energy efficient. So how does your technology specifically help in the data center use case?
For transceivers for data centers and then co-packaged optics for data centers is like one of the big driving forces behind integrated photonics. And that comes from the bandwidth and energy requirements. So it's, at least the first time I heard this, was a shocking statistic that you get more CO2 from data centers than you do from all of aviation. And then about a third of that comes from the communication within data centers. So when you send information through a copper wire, if you want to increase your bandwidth, you make shorter and shorter pulses, then your effective resistance increases. So you have to turn the power up, which heats up the wire, which increases the resistance again, and eventually you just hit some limit. And there's a switch to using photonics, because you can have higher bandwidth, but also greatly reduced energy costs. So that's where the big push has come from for this. And our role in that is essentially streamlining and accelerating the element of those chips that go into the transceivers.
That's brilliant. Do stay in touch with us, won't you? You've got a lot of things to be working on. So come back to us and tell us what your next steps are.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can make the 20-meter trip anytime.
Today's show was produced by Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and supported by our media partner, Business Weekly. The Cambridge Tech Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms and on cambridgetechpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. It'll really help others discover the show.
Your pace, our protection. At Howden, we understand tech startups and scale-ups need insurance that moves with them. From launch to exit, we cover it all, adapting to your growth. No limits, no boundaries, just people-first insurance built for innovators like you. Howden, with you every step of the way.